Good morning. My name is Eric. I am the pastor here. It's great to see everybody. You know, when it comes to shopping at the grocery store, I am useless. I am hopeless. My wife the other day gave me a list of things to get at the grocery store. It was like baby carrots, milk, and pasta. And so I get to the store and I realize that she hasn't specified what kind of pasta I need to get. And so I said to her, I texted her, I said, what kind of pasta do you want? She goes, I don't know, whatever you want. Okay, I am not a fool. I know that there is some kind of pasta that she does and doesn't want. So I say, come on now, help me out. And she just says, get whatever is on sale. Okay, the only sale was like buy 10 boxes, or it was lasagna. And I know she didn't mean lasagna. So we had a back and forth text conversation about what to get. And finally, I just took a picture of a box. It was like, I'm getting this. And then I was already on the other aisle when she told me to get something different. And I was like, well, I already got my box, and I'm doing that anyway. So I am not great at the grocery store. So to make up for this, I try. I'm not always the greatest at getting there to help her, but I try when my wife gets home with the groceries, I try to help bring the groceries in. Now, I know for some of you, especially our home, we're very competitive. When that happens, it becomes a goal or a competition to see who can bring in the most bags of groceries, or if you will, if you can bring them all on one trip. So I have some grocery bags here, and you know what this is like, right? Because some of you, you're really serious about this. Your game is really good because you start going like this, right? You put it all up your arm, you start twisting them around your fingers. By the time you make it in to the garage from your car, your fingers are turning blue because you've got too many bags of groceries, and I'm going to barely be able to get all these up here. Give me a second. So we've got our groceries, and you get that walk, right? And then if you got it off-center, you know you're leaning, and that's bad for your back. But you do whatever you can to make that trip as quickly as you can and as few of times as you can. And why do you do this? Because your time is important. Forget about your back. Forget about blood circulation and flow in your fingers. You want to get back to the TV, right? You want to get back to what it is that you were doing before you had to get up off the couch. And I do appreciate getting up and helping you, my lovely wife. So why do we do this? We do this because our time is precious. Our time is precious. We don't want to waste all these trips going back and forth. And those are actually very heavy, so I'm glad I'm putting those down. We are in a series of messages called The Art of Neighboring. And last week we talked about identifying our neighbors. Identifying our neighbors. I hope you've taken some time to fill out the block map that we gave you last week. If you don't have one of these, we have them at the tables in the back and at the information booth. This block map is just really simple. You can kind of think of it as like the people across the street from you, next to you, and then behind you. You may not have that kind of a layout. I live in a cul-de-sac, so it doesn't really quite work. But generally speaking, most of us are going to have 6 to maybe 8 people that are in the direct vicinity of our homes. And there's 3 blanks on here. The first one is where you write your neighbors' names. Now, if you're like me, that might be terrifying for you to realize that you don't know your neighbors' names. The second blank is information that you've learned through a conversation with them. So like we said last week, don't put they like camping if you're saying that because you see the camper outside their house. Like, talk to them about where they like to camp. And then the third blank is really more personal, and this could take years to get to this one. And the third blank is, like, what are their dreams? What are their hopes? What are their motivations? What are their concerns in their life? Is there maybe a need that you can serve? So it really develops there. So what we're doing throughout this series and what we're going to be doing this year is we're going to fill out this block map, and we're going to spend time loving our neighbors throughout this year. Now, please understand that none of this is intended to be stalker-ish or creepy, okay? So don't do this in a weird way, like go up to them and randomly look at them weirdly and ask them their names and then run away, and then write it down. Like, be normal. We want to love and develop a genuine, real relationship with our neighbors. This isn't about an agenda. The only agenda we have is to love them. Like we talked last week, when we talked about the Good Samaritan, we want to go to our neighbors, we want to see their need, and we want to serve their need. That's the heart of what we're talking about. Now, maybe as we talked about doing this last week, learning about our neighbors, identifying them, praying for them, and working on our relationship with them, maybe some of you felt like I did just a minute ago with all of these grocery bags in my hands. And you're sitting there, and maybe last week, or even now, if you weren't here last week, you're hearing about, wait, I gotta develop a relationship with my neighbor. You might say, Pastor Eric, my hands are already full. My hands are already full. I've already got a lot of things going on. I've got church attendance. See, Pastor Eric, I'm here today, and I've got responsibilities with my family, because family's important. Don't forget, Pastor Eric, that I've got a job. And that job is important so I can take care of my family. And, I just need some me time every once in a while. So I need to make sure that I do that. And then you've got maybe another committee that you're serving on that's in the community, whatever it is. And Pastor Eric, my hands are full. And you tell me I have to pick up that other thing. I don't know that I got time for my neighbors. I don't know if I'm able to get one more thing around these fingers because my life is so filled and it's got so many other responsibilities that I have that I'm responsible for. So what do we do then? We're talking about prioritizing today. We're talking about priorities. What's really important in your life? We're talking about all the different bags that you have in your life, all the different responsibilities, and what we need to do with them. Now, last week, we talked from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, and this is the story of the Good Samaritan. And in this story, we see that a man Jesus tells this story. It's a man that's beaten up, and a Samaritan comes along, and he goes to this man that's beaten up, he sees him, and he serves him. And we saw that Jesus' point is that neighboring is not a noun. That's how the guy got into the conversation with Jesus. He says, who's my neighbor? Noun. Who am I obligated to? Who's the thing or the person that I have to take care of? And by the end, Jesus tells the story, and at the end he says, who was the neighbor? See, for Jesus, neighboring is a verb. It's something that we do. It's not a status that's on someone else. We do this. We serve, and we love, and we give. And if we're going to love our neighbors in this way, it means that we need to perhaps reorient our life and our priorities so that we can love our neighbors in this way. This week, we're looking at the verses immediately following the story of the Good Samaritan. And we're going to hear a story here about two sisters, an interaction that they had with Jesus. And through this interaction, we're going to be challenged to evaluate and to reorient the priorities in our life. So let's look at verse 38. Just immediately after that story is told. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. Now, we've already said that Martha has a sister named Mary, but they also have a brother whose name is Lazarus. And this is the Lazarus that in another gospel we find Jesus raising from the dead. We don't know a lot about Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but we do know that they supported Jesus' ministry, and we know that they were friends with him. They had a close relationship with Jesus. And what we see here is we see Martha inviting Jesus into her home. Now, I'm sure it's similar for you in your homes, but when we have company over, it's like a whole week of cleaning to prepare, right? We're dusting and we're cleaning up the clutter. We're preparing everything just right. Just don't look at our closets when you come over to our house. Some of you are nodding. You know how it is. If people are coming over, throw it in the closet. I don't care how. Lock it. Just get it in there. That's what we do. Why do we do this? Because we want to be good hosts. We want to create an environment where people feel comfortable and they feel welcomed and they can tell that we've prepared for them to be there. And it's the same way in the ancient world. It's the same way in the first century. In some ways, you could even say that hospitality was even more important to them. And so what Martha is doing is she's taking care of the needs that go along with that. The issue is that something is a little bit off, and we see this in the next verse, 39. Martha had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Now, this would have been a little bit odd as an occurrence to take place here, because that phrase, to sit at someone's feet, that was not a description, but that was an expression. That was saying something very specific. Now, this isn't just a picture of Mary sitting starstruck in front of Jesus, the famous rabbi and healer. She isn't like, oh, wow, Jesus is here. She might have been, but that's not what these words are saying. These words are saying that expression of sitting at someone's feet was used for a disciple with a rabbi, with a disciple and a teacher. And what we see here is we see Mary sitting in the role of a disciple for Jesus. Now, in the ancient world, throughout the world, but also in the home, there were different spaces, if you will. There were certain areas where men went, and there were certain areas where women went, and you didn't cross over into the other areas. And so whether it would be in a home or in a public setting, there were just some given areas, like you just didn't go there. And what's happening here with Mary is Mary has crossed over one of those invisible boundaries. And so for Mary to be sitting there at Jesus' feet as a disciple, she's a female. Why is she sitting in front of Jesus, listening to him teach? Now, in other words, what Mary is doing is very much against the grain of that culture. Verse 40. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, what, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. So, look, I've got two boys. And in our home, everything has to be 50-50, even Steven. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, he got more French fries than I did. Okay, I'm sorry. We're not trying to love him more by giving him an extra fry. How did you count them that fast? Everything has to be even. Why does he get to stay up later than I do? Why he's played the video games longer than I did? All of those different things are in the home, and I'm sure that there's a little bit of that going on here with these two sisters. It's not fair. It's not even. But Martha's problem isn't just that it's uneven. Martha has a problem because Mary is acting outside of what was expected in society. Mary has crossed over into the man's space, and she's acting like a disciple. And I just think that as, kind of a quick aside, this isn't really where we're going with the message, but I can't go through a passage like this and not mention this. There are critics of Christianity and religious people and the church and the Bible, and they will say things like, the Bible is just kind of repressive. The Bible speaks down to women. It doesn't, it's really negative towards women. It's just an old, antiquated thing. But in fact, the opposite is true. What Jesus does is he affirms Mary sitting at his feet. He encourages it, in fact, in the next couple of verses here. So don't be taken by that line of thinking or that lie that the culture might say is like, oh, the Bible's just an ancient book that is repressive for women and it's this bad kind of negative thing. No, Jesus himself says, no, this is a good thing that you're doing, Mary. You need to sit at my feet. Now, notice the difference between these sisters. Martha is telling Jesus what to say. Martha is saying, Jesus, you need to tell Mary this. Mary's position, rather, is the exact opposite. Jesus, I just want to hear what you have to say to me. I'm not going to put my agenda on you, but I just want to sit here and hear what you have to say and know you. Jesus responds in verses 41 through 42. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Now, Jesus is not being patronizing. He's not speaking down to Martha, but he's actually being very affectionate to her when he says her name twice. Jesus cares about Martha. Jesus has this close relationship with her, and Jesus is understanding her frustration, but at the same time, he's willing to communicate the truth to her as well. Now, what he does is he redirects Martha, and he reminds her of what is most important. Now, notice, he doesn't correct Martha in the sense that she's done something wrong, because Martha hasn't done anything wrong. Martha hasn't sinned here. In fact, you could argue that what Martha was doing was good, It was culturally acceptable and expected. She was serving Jesus. If Jesus came to my house today in like physical bodily form, I would want to serve him too. So there's nothing wrong with what Martha was doing. But Jesus does correct her in the sense of turning her attention to something else, and he brings clarity to her. He says, look, you're doing a lot of good, expected things, but your sister has chosen the best thing. Jesus says, you're worried about many things. This is the same language that Jesus uses in other places in the Gospel of Luke. This is kind of like a sub-theme, if you will, in the Gospel of Luke. 2 chapters earlier, Jesus tells us a story, a parable, about a sower sowing seed. And it's like someone who spreads God's word to people around them. And he says this in verse 14. He said, the seed that fell among the thorns stands for those who hear, but as they go on their way, they are choked by life's worries. So Jesus talks about how these issues of our life can choke out the gospel, and they can distract us. The worries of this life can distract us from what we are called to do and who we are called to love. 2 chapters after our text, in chapter 12, Jesus said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, or what you will wear. So what Jesus is doing is he's reminding Martha about what's really important. She was concerned about the temporary at the expense of the eternal. She was worried about this earth instead of the kingdom of heaven. And she lost sight of the best thing because of all the good things that she was doing. In church, I wonder how many of us are like Martha. How many of us are doing all sorts of good things at the expense of the best thing? How many of us have our hands loaded down with all of these different kinds of bags and responsibilities, good things? Take a job, taking care of my family, even getting some time for my own personal rest and sanity. These are good things, but I wonder how many of us are doing these good things at the expense of the great thing in loving our neighbor. How many of us have done that? Church, I believe we are called to prioritize the things that are a priority to God. Is it possible we are settling for the good when we could be doing what's best? What is the priority of your life? What's the priority of your life? Are you settling for what's good when you could be doing what's best? Is your goal in life to make a lot of money? Is your goal in life to provide an inheritance for your kids? Or maybe your goal in life is just to arrive safely at death. Maybe your goal is just to get to heaven, and that's it there. And if those are your goals, might I suggest that the priorities of heaven are a little bit different than just those things. Those are good things. They're not bad, but there's something greater. Jesus tells Martha, Mary has chosen what is better. And what did Mary choose to do? She chose to be a disciple. She chose to sit at Jesus' feet. She didn't want to just do things for Jesus and be disconnected from what was in his heart. She wanted to be with Jesus, and she wanted to hear his heart and respond to that. We are to make Christ's priorities our priorities. As we saw last week, we can summarize Jesus' priorities in two phrases: love God and love others. That's why the mission of our church. It's to love God and to love others. You know, last words are important to us, aren't they? Last words are really important. The last things that I say to my boys when I drop them off at school are things like, be good, have a good day, and I love you. Like I want those to be the last kind of thing, the last things that my boys hear from me. You go away on a trip and you leave your loved ones, and what do you say? I love you. I'll see you when I get back, right? I mean, you want to express. Last words are very important. Some of you know this with your spouses because you fight, and both of you want the last word. Guys, give it up. Just let her have it, okay? You want the last word. It's really important. Last words at the end of a life are important as well. I hope that my last words before I die are not, hey guys, watch this, right? I hope that's not my last words. But you know, when we know what our last words are going to be, we weigh those out, don't we? Like if it's really important for us when someone that we know is dying, we want to have our last words with them, right? We want to speak to them and tell them how much we care about them, and vice versa. When we get to the end of our lives, we'll want to do the same. You know, Jesus, just before he ascended into heaven, spoke some last words about his priority for us. And I think that it's be helpful for us to look at those today. And in every one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we find these last words. And then we also find them in the book of Acts. And so I just want to read through these last words and see if you can pick up a theme here. In Matthew 28, verses 19 through 20, it's very famous, probably the most famous of all these passages. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. He says, go and make disciples. Mark 16:15, he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Luke 24, he told them, this is what is written, the Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations. To all nations, beginning at Jerusalem, you are witnesses of these things. John 20:21. Again, Jesus said, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And then Acts 1:8. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. So church, are you more like Martha or are you more like Mary? Sometimes when we read this passage, we kind of divide out kind of personality types of Mary and Martha, and we try to figure out who we are. Am I more like Mary? Am I more like Martha? Am I more active in my faith or passive? Am I more doing upfront things or behind things? Am I more contemplative in my faith? I'm not talking about any of that today. If you want to make those analogies, you can. We need both. Without one, you don't eat, and without the other, you don't worship, okay? So those are fine, but I don't know that that's the real point of this passage. At least not what we're looking at today. What I want to stress with this passage today is this idea that Jesus says to her, look, there's all these good things you're doing, but there is the best thing that Mary has picked out. And I wonder if some of us aren't a little bit more like Martha, just kind of fumbling around with all these bags in our life, and we're forsaking the best thing. Mary found a way to pick up the best thing and to do that in her life. In Acts 1:8, Jesus tells his disciples that we are to be his witnesses in 4 different places: in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Now, when you look at these geographically, this is it's not exactly, but it's kind of like a concentric circle reaching outward. Jerusalem is their hometown, right where they lived. And then going from there, it was Judea, and then Samaria, and then it was to the ends of the earth. Jesus is telling his disciples to start right where you are and to work your way out. Now, if we could put it this way, we would say, be a witness to your neighbors, to your town, to your country, and to your world, or something to that effect. And church, I wonder sometimes, like some of you are awesome. You give to missions, you give to other things to help our missionaries overseas, and it's like we skip to the very last one. And that's important. We need to give to our missionaries. We need to reach the ends of the earth. But, God has put you in a home or in a neighborhood for a particular reason to reach people that God has ordained for you to be right next to, or in at least close proximity to. I acknowledged last week that some of you live kind of on the outskirts of town, and you may not. You have another neighbor for like a quarter mile or so. That's fine. You don't have to fill out all 8 blanks on that page, but fill out the one. Because your time commitment in reaching that one is going to be much greater than the rest of us who have 8 people to reach out to, okay? So the point is who's close to you? Who's close to you that you can minister to and reach? Last week, I said something that my wife didn't understand in the message, and she asked me at the end. And I thought, if my wife doesn't understand, I better just kind of clarify that. I made a statement about like cheering from the back or behind or something like that, or encouraging you all, standing in the back. And what I meant by that was that I am trying to figure this whole neighbor thing out myself. We just moved, so I have a really good excuse for not knowing my neighbors' names, right? I just moved there like 2 or 3 months ago, and it's been super cold, so I've only really seen my neighbors a couple of times. But I'll be honest, our last place that we lived for 5 or 6 or so years, 6 or 7 years, I guess, I couldn't tell you most of the names of the people on my cul-de-sac. I know a couple of names. There was 3 guys on our cul-de-sac at one point that had the name Dave. So it was a pretty good chance I was talking to a Dave when I was outside, So, I mean, I knew that. But so when I say cheering from behind, I mean that there's just some of you, you're doing this really, really well. I had a conversation with one of the men in our church this week, and man, I am so proud to pastor this church because of people like this. He just told me all about several different neighbors, people in his life, that he was able to lead to the Lord. And he wasn't bragging, he was just telling me his life experience. And what I think is really important too is he said, he goes, really, somebody else kind of planted the seed and somebody else watered it. I was just there at the right time in the right place. But what he had done is he had loved his neighbors for days and weeks and months and years, and led to the point where he built a relationship with them where he was able to have those kinds of conversations. God can do miracles, but the chances are really good that your neighbor's not going to walk over to your house, ring your doorbell, and say, "How can I become a Christian? Can you lead me into this, the sinner's prayer," or something like that. That's just not going to happen. But when you are faithful to go to your neighbors, to see their needs, and serve them, that's when it takes place. I had another conversation with someone this week, and they were telling me about all the neighbors that they invited to Cornerstone. And that's great, but that's not even really the ultimate goal of what we're talking about here today. The great commandment isn't love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength and invite your neighbor to Cornerstone. No, it's not. The ultimate goal is to love. Because once you just invite your neighbor, that commandment's done. No, that's not the commandment. The commandment isn't to invite your neighbor. The commandment is to love your neighbor. And that is ongoing. That's when it's easy and when it's hard. It's when the person has a different viewpoint than you. It's when a person doesn't even want anything to do with God. It doesn't matter. You love them anyway. This is a long-term thing that we're talking about. And if we're going to do this and do this well, some of us in the room have to do a little bit of a better job picking up the neighbor bag. And not just leaving it there. Because what tends to happen is we tend to just fill our lives with other things. There are some mindsets that distract us and cause us to reorder our priorities. And I'm sure there's a million of them, but there's two that have been on my heart this week. And the first is this. The first is fear. I think that fear is a distraction that will reorder our priorities. Fear is when it's like we're afraid to admit that we don't know our neighbor's name. Hey, I've lived next to you for 20 years. I don't remember your name. We're afraid of that conversation. Or maybe we're afraid that we'll say something stupid, or that they'll reject us, or even worse, they'll reject Christ. Fear leads us back to safety and comfort. It draws us away from bold acts of faith, and we end up just playing it safe in our life. The other distraction that we have that can reorder our priorities is selfishness. And look, I love you all. You're all wonderful people, but let's be super honest here. Like, we're all very selfish people. I mean, we just are. In American culture today, we just lean and trend towards being selfish. All of us here. What about me? What about my time? What about my comfort and my needs? It can be hard to give and to give and to give and to give and not see any return. It can be hard to just give and give. And it's not always convenient for me to be a neighbor in the ways that we're talking about. But loving God and loving others and loving our neighbors, it's either a priority or it's not. It's either a priority or it's not. We are called, church, to make the priorities of Christ our priority. To love Him and to love the people around us. And that's what Jesus did for us. He made us His priority. In the grand scheme of things, there's a lot of important things in this universe, in this creation that God created. Keeping the planets aligned, making sure that everything works the way it's supposed to do. But Jesus saw fit to be the best neighbor there ever was. And He picked up that love others bag, and He came here to earth, and He lived among us. He went to us, He saw our need, and then He served our needs on the cross. What a profound thing. That God would take up the neighbor bag for us, for you, for me. And none of us are perfect, right? I mean, you might be in the room today, because I've heard these kinds of conversations. Oh, I don't know. Those people are so holy. They're so perfect. They're not. They just hide it really, really well. Right? That's what Christians are. Christians are really good at hiding it. We all have flaws. We all have sin in our life, or have had sin in our life. Some of us are just getting better, and some of us are earlier in the journey and farther on the journey, but we all are working through this. And in spite of the fact that we didn't deserve it, Christ picked up the neighbor bag and said, I love you, I'm going to serve you. And church, the priority for us is to pick up the neighbor bag. And in our series, we are talking very specifically about the people that live around you. Now, allow me for a moment to go really broad. This applies, of course, in a variety of ways. Missions giving, Royal Family Kids Camp that we do for foster care kids. It has to do with this ministry that we're doing on Tuesday nights to love these kids in our local community and the surrounding communities, to love them. These are ways that we love our neighbor. But church, I think what happens for so many of us is we just kind of say, oh, love our neighbor, and we forget about the fact that God has put us square right next to people that we could have a profound impact with. Next week, we're going to be talking about this a little bit more, because being a neighbor can put us in some really difficult situations sometimes and cause us to maybe even be uncomfortable at times. But church, it's worth it to pick up the neighbor bag to fulfill the priority that Christ has for us in our life. So how do we respond to this today? How do we respond to this? We need to eliminate the good, and we need to embrace the great. Eliminate the good and embrace the great. And I don't mean all the good, but some of the good. There are things in your life that are probably good that you need to not do as much so that you can spend more time with your neighbors. And it's easy to make excuses. As a pastor, one of the things that, I get home and I'm like, well, I've been helping people all day. I'm tired. I just need some me time. We got to watch those attitudes. We got to be careful, and we can't let those drive us. Instead, we got to eliminate the good and embrace the great. Mary's actions were countercultural. It was not expected. And to love our neighbors, we're going to need to do the same. People don't expect their neighbors to care in our society, in our culture today. They don't expect their neighbors to care. They expect their neighbors to be quiet. So don't be obnoxious, but go and care. And go surprise your neighbors by loving them and serving their needs. What would it be like if all of us did this? How could we change? I love that little video we showed at the beginning. What if the answer to all of our society's problems were right next door as we loved our neighbor and took care of the needs? This is like absolute life-changing, culture-changing, world-changing. And what if we did it? How would your life be different? How would your neighbor's life be different? How would your eternity be different and your neighbor's eternity? I don't want to just get to heaven. I want to bring a whole bunch of people with me to heaven. Pastor Chris has a great line that he says to his students. He says, we fill seats, we fill heaven, and inviting their friends. And that's true. That's true. If we love our neighbors, I believe we can fill heaven, because they're going to see the love that God has shown to us. So there's two ways that we can respond today. First, find salvation in Jesus. He's the perfect neighbor who came to us, saw us in our sin, and served us by his death on the cross. And if you're far from God today, find salvation in him. He's the perfect neighbor. He picked up the neighbor bag because he loved you and he cared about you, served you on the cross. He went to the cross so that you didn't have to die and spend eternity separate from God in hell. He did that for you. And then second, for us, this is probably going to be our response each week for those of us who are believers in the room. Fill out the block map. Now, you're not going to be able to do the whole thing this week, because, or even probably this year, because to get into some of those conversations with your neighbors, especially it's cold right now, and you're not, it's hard to interact with people when everybody's running inside because they're cold. I get that. But start praying for your neighbors. Start filling that out. Get their names. Spend time reaching out to them in prayer, and when you can in the cold, build those relationships. Let's pray. God,